On November 12, 1959, a perplexing aircraft first flew. This particular craft was almost unlike anything else. And no, it's not alien in origin. This project was carried out by Avro Canada and was the brainchild of one John Frost. It was the VZ-9 Avrocar, and it was a VTOL aircraft and was originally thought to possibly be able to achieve very high speeds and altitudes. However, within just a couple years, the whole thing was cancelled, and we didn't actually get to see any of this perplexing technology developed further. John Carver Meadows Frost was actually a British aircraft designer, and he had already worked on several notable aircraft for de Havilland, like the Hornet, the Vampire, and the Swallow, before coming to Avro in June of 1947. He was a bit of a dreamer, and he really liked what is known as blue skies research, which refers to scientific research in domains where real-world applications are not immediately apparent. Basically, the whole point is to create something very imaginative, even if you don't know why someone would need such a thing, you're still gonna do it just to do it. And sometimes blue skies research can turn out things that are legitimately useful, even if it wasn't obvious at first. It's also been defined as research without a clear goal or curiosity-driven science. Now, Frost had already worked on the Avro CF-100, which was a good but conventional airplane, before he created a research team that he called the Special Projects Group, or SPG, which makes it sound way more sinister than it actually was, and he tried to surround himself with other engineers that shared his imaginative mindset, wanting to push the envelope and create something really weird. During this time, Frost was pretty interested in jet engine design, as well as ways to improve the efficiency of the compressor without sacrificing the simplicity of the turbine engine. Certain designs he looked at he thought were too complex, and he wanted things to be as simple as possible. So he designed a new type of engine layout that had the flame cans, basically the combustor, lying just outside the outer rim of the centrifugal compressor. And power for the compressor was drawn from a new type of turbine that was similar to a centrifugal fan, which was different to the more conventional pinwheel-like designs. And the turbine drove the compressor using gearing, rather than a shaft. The engine wound up arranged in the form of a very large disc, and he called it a pancake engine. But the thrust on this thing actually exited from around the entire rim. So this kind of made it difficult to adapt it to a typical aircraft. In any event, the SPG started developing VTOL aircraft because at the time, a lot of militaries were interested in that potential, and Frost felt the excellent performance of his new engine would be a natural fit for VTOL aircraft, due to its expected power-to-weight ratio being, well, very high. But the problem he had was how was he going to use the weird thrust setup to actually move the aircraft forward, not to mention fitting the engine into a suitable airframe in general. First, he looked into a series of ducts and vents that could redirect the thrust flowing out of the front of the engine more towards the rear. And the aircraft itself was meant to be disc-shaped, but this was more angular, kind of like a spade. It was definitely weird looking, and the whole thing was designated Project Y. In 1952, the Canadian Defence Research Board actually was interested enough that they funded the effort with a $400,000 contract. That's Canadian dollars, not American, just so we're clear. And by 1953, they had a wooden mock-up of it. But it was quickly realized that creating something like this was going to be violently expensive, and the Canadian government didn't want to give even more money to the project. But at the same time this was going on, Frost was also getting a little bit distracted, and he was becoming fascinated with something called the Coandă effect, which describes the tendency of a fluid jet to stay attached to a convex surface. Frost thought that this effect could be utilized with his engine design to produce a more practical VTOL aircraft than what they were currently working on, with the exhaust actually flowing outward over the upper surface of the aircraft and then being directed downward over a flap-like arrangement, rather than with awkward ducts and pipes like with Project Y. He produced quite a few small designs, using compressed air in place of an engine, and he eventually settled on a disc shape, which he found would be effective at subsonic and supersonic speeds, at least based on his own calculations. This particular design was dubbed Project Y2. But nothing really came of this until 1953, when a group of United States defense experts visited Avro to actually view the new CF-100 fighter jet. But at some point during their visit, Frost totally took over the tour and rerouted it into his special projects area, where he showed off the Project Y mock-up, as well as models and drawings that some of which hadn't even been seen by the senior officials at Avro. These did indeed show plans for a completely circular disc-shaped aircraft. The United States military was suddenly interested. It was a curious idea, and they had the money for it. The US Air Force agreed to take over funding, and they issued a contract for $750,000 US this time, in 1955. By 1956, Avro management was also interested enough to further commit $2.5 million to build a private venture prototype. And in March of 1957, the Air Force also added further funding, and the aircraft became known as Weapons System 606A. At this point in development, there were a whole bunch of different designs thrown out there, but they all involved the disc shape. As, well, that was the whole point of it. It had to be a round disc sort of thing. But as time went on, certain debates went on in the internals of the US Air Force, as a lot of groups were trying to gain funding for their own projects. But development did still continue, and then in 1958, Frost proposed building a smaller, proof-of-concept test vehicle that he referred to as the Avrocar. Since building the large-scale version he wanted to was going to take some time, he thought it would be best if they built a smaller one to show off the potential of the technology. And at this time, the US Army was actually involved in a lot of different experiments on smaller VTOL aircraft that would act as flying jeeps, so they also became interested in Avro's concept as a result. Frost pitched his smaller design, both as a prototype of a vehicle suitable for the Army's needs, as well as an aerodynamic testbed for the larger version. This new plan was actually liked by everybody involved, and a $2 million joint services contract was issued, and it was managed by the Air Force, for the purposes of building and testing 2 Avro cars. The Army were the ones that designated it the VZ-9, although they entered it with a -AV, referring to Avro. And the Army had very high hopes for this thing. One Army general was apparently overheard remarking that the Huey would actually be the last helicopter the Army would ever use, since helicopters in general would soon be replaced by the Avro car. Of course, that's laughable looking back, but that was what they really thought at the time. They really believed that they were looking at the future here. And in March 1959, an additional $1.77 million contract was received for a second prototype. And at rollouts, projected performance was actually way beyond the requirements initially stated. The maximum speed of this thing was said to be 417 kilometers an hour, with a 10,000-foot ceiling, a 130-mile range, with a 1,000-pound payload. However, right about the same time that Avro was building the test models, they had a bit of a crisis. See, the Canadian government chose to cancel the Avro CF-105 Aero program, which is another story in and of itself and one of the most tragic losses in aviation history. It was known as Black Friday, February 20th, 1959. The reason why this affected the Avro car is that, well, the Aero project was giving Avro a whole lot of money to actually have, employees. And when that was cancelled, that money was gone. So Avro had to lay off almost all of their employees, including the SPG guys. They did actually rehire most of them about 3 days after they had laid them off, but it wasn't quite the same when they got back. See, the team now included people from the CF-100 and CF-105 teams, and production and experimentation was moved into a main building, not off to the side like it was before. And the company higher-ups became much more involved in the group's operations. And this was a problem as it kind of stifled their creativity a little bit, because they couldn't be as experimental and wacky as they had been. The other design teams were a lot more conventional, and the company brass didn't want to see any nonsense, especially since, well, with the cancellation of the Aero, The company was also in dire straits. They needed this project to work, and they couldn't afford any crazy nonsense right now. And it didn't help that the US Air Force Project Office actually recommended that all related work on the Avrocar be cancelled. Frost himself was forced to try and rescue his project, and he managed to make a pretty resounding case for continuing it. In late May 1959, the US Air Force did allow the program to continue. The Avrocar would wind up with the same basic shape as a frisbee, the upper surface of the disc being fairly curved while the bottom much less. They were 18 feet in diameter and 3.5 feet thick. They had a 124-blade turbo rotor that sat in the center, and power for that was provided by 3 Continental J69-T-9 jet engines that were attached to the truss. Each engine had its own fuel and oil tanks, as well as other support systems, although it was expected that those would be interconnected in future models. The majority of the thing's airframe was made of aluminum, and they had an empty weight of 3,000 pounds. Controlling it involved a single-sided mounted control stick. Pitch and roll were controlled through conventional fore-aft and side-to-side motions, while yaw could be controlled by twisting the stick. No mechanical linkages were actually used. The stick controlled the flow of high-pressure air around the craft, which either directly attached to several different kinds of control surfaces, or indirectly through local cable linkages to replace controls that were intended to be cable actuated. It was a perplexing experience all around, but it was quickly discovered that the craft was inherently unstable in forward flight, as the aerodynamic center of pressure was quite a bit forward of the center of gravity. The Avrocar included a mechanical stability augmentation system that was independent of the pilot's controls. This was in an effort to keep the thing from just crashing and burning horribly. And the thing was manned by a crew of 2, positioned in separate cockpits, squeezed into empty areas of the airframe, almost like an afterthought. In practice, only one pilot was usually on board during testing, though a number of flights were made with an observer in the second cockpit. Several test pilots did handle the thing, and at least one described the experience as like trying to balance on a beach ball. That's probably not a good review. The first of the prototypes was rolled out of the Avro Malton factory in May of 1959, and from the 9th of June to the 7th of October, it was tested in a static hover rig. But there were problems almost immediately. Hot gas from the exhaust was found to mix back into the intakes when the aircraft was hovering, which reduced engine thrust. On top of that, the fan generated lift only from a small area of its surface, which lowered the overall available thrust by quite a bit. The ducts also had a higher loss of thrust than was expected, and they tried to modify it to fix these problems, but nothing really solved them to any significant degree. These issues would of course reduce maximum lift at higher altitudes, out of the ground effect that the thing was operating in, to over 1,000 pounds less than the empty weight of the aircraft. Which, in case you didn't understand that fully, it basically means this thing was not going to fly. At all. Outside of the ground effect. That's the only way it could stay in the air. It couldn't actually get to any high altitude at all. It was physically impossible for it to do so, unless you launched it off of a catapult. But I don't recommend that, since it wouldn't stay in the air for very long. Following the initial test, that vehicle was actually sent to NASA for wind tunnel testing. The second prototype was completed in August of 1959, and on the 29th of September, the first ever attempt to hover was made with the Avrocar tethered to the ground. It did become airborne, but then it suffered an uncontrollable roll and pitch coupled oscillation, and that forced each of the 3 wheels into the ground. The pilot shut down all the engines in response, and changes were made to the stability system to provide more control authority, while new tethers were investigated to improve the ability to control these sorts of issues in the future. As testing continued, though, it became clear the problem had nothing to do with really any of that. It was just because of the way the thing was designed. The engineers started calling the effect hubcapping, as it kind of looked like what happened when a hubcap spun on the ground. Though further investigations did reveal exactly what was causing the problem. While in the ground effect, the high-pressure air under the craft was actually trapped, and that would fill the entire area, thus providing a stable base. But when the craft rose out of the ground effect, the air formed itself into a single narrow column, and at some altitudes that were never quite determined, the craft would momentarily transition from the weird cushion effect that they had at low altitude to this weird narrow effect instead. And when this happened, one side of the craft would be entirely supported while the support was actually disappearing from the other, which you can recognize as being kind of an issue. That led to a strong pitching motion towards the unsupported side. As soon as that happened, that side would approach the ground and re-establish the supporting air that it had had before, while the other side would then be raised above this limit. This, of course, went back and forth repeatedly, with the craft just continually rolling from side to side. Eventually, to fix it, they cut a series of 52 holes in the bottom of the vehicle, located radially 3 feet from the center. Those were meant to provide a central jet to stabilize the ground cushion, and apparently it did actually kind of solve it. So they conducted the first completely free flights on November 12th, 1959. But that test showed that the nozzle control system was completely unacceptable. It would never work. To keep it simple, basically the system forced a loss of altitude every single time the pilot tried to maneuver, which you may recognize as very bad. And after 5 flights, testing was temporarily halted on December 5th. Over the winter, they installed a completely new design system for controlling it. And Avro was still convinced that the concept was workable. They proposed a new program for a major rework of the propulsion and control system. Before those modifications could be completely implemented, funding ran out in March of 1961. Frost's proposals for a modified design weren't accepted, and the Avrocar and all associated programs were cancelled. Annoyingly, he may have been onto something, because the prototype that had been sent to NASA actually did receive some of those modifications, and they managed to show that there was significant improvement in controlling the thing. After the project was cancelled, Avro did try to push into further disk-based ideas, but no one was really interested in this perplexing technology. It wasn't working as quickly as they had hoped, and there was doubt as to whether or not it would ever really work at all, at least when compared to conventional aircraft. In terms of their VTOL needs, those would be later filled by the Hawker Siddeley Harrier. A conventional aircraft, yes, but it could redirect its own thrust downwards to, well, hover. The Avrocar was just too weird, too wacky, and just not worth spending the money on. Further side research into design led to the assumption and current belief that the Avrocars were just a dead end in terms of VTOL design. They really couldn't go anywhere from where they were at. But to this day, they are very intriguing to look at. Definitely a unique piece of aviation history. So unique, in fact, that both prototypes did indeed enter preservation. Oh yes, they're both still around. They weren't scrapped. The second prototype is currently under restoration at the U.S. Army Transportation Museum in Fort Eustis, Virginia, and the first prototype is currently on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Somedude267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1 Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Roro Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Lord Hoff 444, Mark Holding, Murder Drones Doll, A-Person 723, DM Trouble Typhoon, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Isaac for 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Albert Jaspers, Tom Redlion, Ennis Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, Dr. Racer 78, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, and Joshua Long. Till next time, this is Darkness, and a bit well of fun. Farewell.